That's what Nietzsche comments on in this particular quote. Of what is great, one either must be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming. What can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism. Nihilism is the belief in nothing, or the belief that things have no meaning. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe. Restlessly, violently, and headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value those values really had. We require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? Point of departure. It's an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. Ours is the most honest and compassionate age. So Nietzsche dispenses right away with sociological explanations for people's lack of belief in meaning in life. You know, and a lot of what you're taught in universities is sociological in its causal thinking. And the causal path is often, it's the social conditions that people find themselves in that determine their response to the world. But Nietzsche stands violently against that perspective, and this is 150 years ago, even before in some sense it was thoroughly well developed. And the reason he stands against it is because he points out that wherever you're positioned in society, your position can be made subject to any number of individual interpretations. Its meaning, like the meaning of being poor, say, or the meaning of being comparatively poor, isn't a meaning that's etched in stone. And so it has to be interpreted psychologically before it can become a causal factor. And if it can be interpreted psychologically, then it's not a fact like the existence of a mountain is a fact. It's still an interpretation. He says distress itself, whether psychic, psychological, physical, or intellectual, also need not produce nihilism. So he also rejects suffering itself as a cause of nihilism. Need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Rather, it is in one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. It's a rebound from God is the truth to the fanatical faith all is false, an act of Buddhism. So it's a strange interpretation because Nietzsche, although he was violently anti-Christian in his self-presentation to the public, was more like a, in my opinion, was more like a beneficial critic of the Western Christian tradition. And because the first thing he realized was that the domination of the West essentially by the Catholic Church for something like 1900 years was necessary in order for the European mind to become trained and focused. So his point was that unless you learn to place an interpretive scheme on the world and interpret that world in a coherent manner through that scheme, you don't have a trained mind. And for Nietzsche, in some sense, it didn't really matter what the interpretive scheme was. It was just that at some point you had to discipline yourself, and this would be something like a post-adolescent process. You had to discipline yourself by developing an adherence to some sort of coherent deep, coherent view. And the consequence of that, at least in principle, could be that you could come to be the sort of person that would be respectful of the truth, and also someone who regarded truth as a moral virtue, as a higher order moral virtue. But then Nietzsche's point was that Christianity developed that sense in Europe to such a degree that the spirit of truth-seeking went after the axioms of Christianity and demolished them. That was his view of what happened during the Enlightenment as a consequence of the interaction between science and religion. So Nietzsche's view was that the modern mind, we'll say, because we're speaking 150 years later, the modern mind had been trained rigorously to interpret things through a coherent structure. And then once that training had occurred, then it could use any number of coherent structures, and then it could also use its ability to form a relationship with the truth, to criticize the very thing that gave rise to that mind. And that's Nietzsche's diagnosis of the 20th century individual. The pursuit of truth itself had undermined the structure that gave birth to the pursuit of truth. And that left people wide open. It left them wide open, on the one hand, to nihilism. And nihilism is the belief that nothing has meaning. Nothing has any final meaning. And the best way of expressing nihilism is, what the hell difference is it going to make in 1,000 years what we do today? Or in 100 years, for that matter. And it's a rational reduction of all of the experiences of life to rational insignificance. Nothing has any final meaning. And so the question, of course, that emerges from that is, well, why do anything? And a deeper question that emerges from that is, well, why bear suffering? But that's not the only problem from an existential point of view, because the existentialists, and Nietzsche as well, also believed that nihilism was actually unbearable. Because people suffer, they have to have a framework of meaning in which to place the suffering, because otherwise it undermines their ability to live, and people can't move forward in that condition. And so another one of Nietzsche's prognostications was that nihilism would produce its counterpart, which was totalitarianism, and people would leap from their immersion, say, in evolutionarily emergent systems of faith, and jump headlong into rational utopian constructions of reality, because people can't do without an interpretive framework. So it wasn't as if the consequence of moving beyond religion was going to be a step into enlightenment, which is what materialist rationalists always presume. They presume if you could just shed the superstitious claptrap that's associated with your religious heritage, you'd instantly be enlightened. But Nietzsche's point was that is not what's likely to happen. What's likely to happen is two things. People will either give up on life completely and become cynical, prematurely cynical, which is certainly a disease of young people, and maybe it's always been a disease of young people, but it's certainly been a disease of young people since, say, the end of World War II. So they become nihilistic and not believe that anything has any meaning, and that undermines their ability to strive, or they'd fall prey to some sort of rigid ideology. And Nietzsche also understood that if people fell prey to a rigid ideology, or several rigid ideologies, that the only plausible outcome of that would be like exceptionally intense warfare. And of course that's exactly what happened in the 20th century.